Mafia boss Alessandro Moretti, head of the feared Moretti family in Chicago, returned to his estate earlier than planned and stood frozen when he saw Emma, the housekeeper's 3-year-old daughter, standing precariously on a small chair, clumsily trying to iron his white dress shirt. The little girl only wanted to do the work for her mother, who lay burning with fever in the staff quarters, because she was afraid her mother would be dismissed and the two of them would lose their only place to call home. But Alessandro had no idea that the little girl's innocent act that day was about to expose a terrifying secret that had silently taken root right inside his very own estate. The hiss of the iron cut through the quiet room like a small, dangerous breath. Steam rose in thin white ribbons from the pressing board, curling upward through the late afternoon light that fell in a soft golden bar across the marble floor. That single ray of light came through a narrow window near the ceiling, and in that light danced tiny particles of dust and lint from the folded shirts stacked on the counter beside her. Emma was humming. It was a soft tune, barely more than breath, the kind of song a mother sings when the world is closing its eyes for the night. She did not know the words. She only knew the shape of it, the rise and fall her mother's voice made in the small hours when she was afraid. She hummed it now to make the room feel less big, and the iron feel less heavy, and her own tiny hands feel less alone. Alessandro Moretti had commanded rooms full of dangerous men. He had walked into meetings where every eye held a hidden knife. He had watched enemies smile at him across polished tables and known, in the same moment, that one of them would be dead by morning. In all those years he had never once entered a room without knowing what to do next. He did not know what to do now. His feet would not obey him. His hands, so certain in every other part of his life, hung at his sides as if they belonged to a stranger. He simply stood in the doorway, a grown man in a tailored suit, watching a little girl on a plastic chair try to do the work of a woman 3 times her size. The iron hissed again. It jerked slightly in her small grip, and the sound broke something loose in his chest. He moved. 3 long strides carried him across the room. He did not shout. He did not startle her. He simply reached past her small shoulders and pulled the plug from the wall in one clean, silent motion. The hiss died. The room went still. Then he lifted her. His hands, which had signed orders that shaped entire districts of Chicago, closed around her sides with a gentleness that surprised him. She weighed almost nothing. He set her down on the floor and knelt so that he would not tower over her, and for the first time in more years than he could count, he lowered himself before another human being. Emma trembled. Her small chest rose and fell in quick, bird-like breaths. Her enormous brown eyes lifted to meet his, and what he saw in them stopped his heart in a way no gun ever had. It was not simply fear of being caught. It was the deeper, older fear of a child who had learned, somewhere very early, that safety was not something the world owed her. For one long moment, neither of them moved. The iron cooled quietly on the board behind them. Alessandro Moretti had faced men who wanted him dead, but never, in all his life, a pair of eyes so small he could not bring himself to look away from. Alessandro Moretti had built his fortress out of silence and steel. Her small lips parted, and the words came out in a rush, tumbling over one another the way small stones tumble down a hillside when something has been disturbed above them. Sorry. Mama's sick. Mama got hot. I do the work. Please don't send Mama away. Her voice cracked on the last word. She said it the way a child says a prayer she has been rehearsing in her head for days without anyone knowing. Alessandro did not answer. He could not. Something in his throat had closed over, and for one strange, disorienting second he could not remember how to breathe like a man who had been breathing his whole life. He looked at her hands. They were red, painfully red. The skin along her small knuckles had gone pink from steam and effort, and there was a raw place along her right thumb where the edge of the iron must have brushed her without her even noticing. Beside her on the pressing board lay the shirt, wrinkled in 100 wrong places, the collar folded under itself, one sleeve twisted the wrong way around. She had scrubbed her small fists over that fabric until she could barely lift them, and still the shirt looked nothing like the ones her mother folded so neatly each morning. A name surfaced from somewhere in the quiet vault of his memory. Sophia Carter. He knew the name from a personnel file, not from any true knowing. She had come to the estate a little over 2 years ago. Quiet, careful, always in the background where the household staff belonged. He had read her file once, briefly, the way he read all such files, a habit born of caution, not curiosity. He remembered a single line about the father of her child, left before the baby was born. He had turned the page without a second thought, and never turned back to it again. He had passed this woman in his own hallways for 2 years. He had eaten meals she had helped prepare. He had worn shirts her hands had pressed. And in all that time, he had never once looked at her face long enough to remember it. He had never truly looked at this child either. Now he looked. He looked at the small chair, at the reddened hands, at the trembling mouth still whispering the word please, as if repeating it might make him kinder. Very slowly, so as not to frighten her further, Alessandro lowered himself down until he was sitting on his heels on the floor. His tailored trousers pressed against the cold marble. His eyes came level with hers, and for a long moment he simply let her look at him. Then, in a voice softer than any voice he had used in years, he asked, "Where is your mother, little one?" Emma sniffed. She lifted one small hand and pointed with a single trembling finger toward the far end of the hallway, past the kitchens, past the storerooms, toward the low wing at the back of the estate where the staff quarters stood. Alessandro turned his head slowly, following the line of that tiny finger. For years he had ruled every room of this house. He had counted every window, every door, every gate. He held out his hand. For a heartbeat, Emma only stared at it, the wide palm, the clean, blunt fingers, the small silver cufflink at his wrist. She had never touched such a hand before. In her small world, hands like this belonged to men who walked quickly and did not stop for anyone. Then, very slowly, she slid her tiny fingers into his. Her hand disappeared inside his. Alessandro rose, keeping his grip careful, as if the bones of her fingers were something he did not entirely trust himself to hold. Together they walked out of the pressing room and down the long marble corridor. He had never walked this hallway holding a child. He had never walked it holding anyone. They passed the tall windows, the paintings his mother had chosen decades ago, the arched doorways leading into rooms he had not entered in years. At the far end, past the kitchens, the corridor narrowed and grew simpler. The marble gave way to plain tile. The ceilings dropped. The polished wood turned to painted wood, and then to bare paint on plaster. Alessandro slowed. He could not remember the last time he had come this far into his own home. Emma tugged him gently. She knew the way. She stopped before a small door at the end of the servants' wing and pushed it open with her free hand. The room was small. A single bed, a narrow dresser, a wooden chair by the window. A framed drawing was pinned above the headboard, one of Emma's, done in bright crayon. The floor had been swept clean. The curtain, thin from washing, was pulled halfway across a window that faced only the estate's high stone wall. And on the bed, Sophia Carter lay pale as paper. Her dark hair clung damp against her forehead. Sweat had gathered along her collarbone. She was so thin, so still, that for a terrible moment Alessandro thought he had come too late for something he had not even known was happening. Then her eyes opened. She saw him standing in her doorway, the master of the estate, in a suit that cost more than the entire wing she lived in, and she tried, with a strength she should not have had, to push herself upright. "Mr. Moretti, please, she should not have the little one. She should not have. Lie down." His voice was low, firm, but not unkind. It was the voice of a man used to being obeyed and unused to raising his tone to make it so. Sophia sank back against the pillow, her chest rising and falling too quickly. Alessandro drew the phone from his jacket pocket and pressed a single number. The line connected in half a ring. "Come now," he said. Nothing more. He ended the call. Sophia's eyes filled with tears. "Please, I don't have money for. You will never finish that sentence in this house." She fell silent. She stared at him as if she did not quite believe he was real. Alessandro's gaze drifted, almost by habit, to the small nightstand beside her bed. A plain glass of water sat there, half empty, catching the pale light from the window. He looked at it only for a moment. Only for a moment. Then he looked away, not knowing that the truth of everything had already been sitting quietly on that bedside table, waiting for him to see it. Dr. Bianchi arrived in 20 minutes. He came alone, as he always did when Alessandro called on that particular line. He was a small, tidy man in his 60s with silver hair and steady hands, and in all the years he had served the Moretti family, he had never once asked a question he was not paid to answer. He set his black leather case down on the narrow dresser without a word and went to work. Alessandro stepped back into the doorway to give him room. Dr. Bianchi checked Sophia's temperature. He checked her pulse. He looked into her eyes with a small light and studied her tongue and the palms of her hands. He asked her, in a voice so gentle it did not seem to belong in the room, how long she had felt this way. 2 days, she whispered. Perhaps 3. He asked what she had eaten, what she had drunk. Nothing, she said. Only water. A little bread yesterday. The doctor was quiet for a long time. Alessandro noticed that quiet. Dr. Bianchi was many things, but silent when things were ordinary was not one of them. When a case was simple, he would say so at once, and then complain cheerfully about being called out for so small a matter. This silence was of a different kind. It was the silence of a careful man choosing his next words with unusual care. The doctor turned. He drew a small blood sample from Sophia's arm with practiced fingers. Then, without changing his expression, he lifted the plain glass of water from the nightstand and slipped it into a sealed pouch from his case. "For testing," he said mildly. "A precaution." Alessandro did not answer. He only nodded. Once, the doctor stepped out to make his call. For a long while, Alessandro simply sat down in the wooden chair by the window. His long frame did not fit it well. He rested his forearms on his knees and watched the woman on the bed drift into a shallow, restless sleep. He did not hear Emma come in. He only felt her. She padded across the tile on small bare feet, climbed onto his lap without asking, and settled there as if she had always belonged in exactly that place. She did not speak. She only pressed her cheek against the front of his jacket and closed her eyes. Children, he thought distantly, know the safe places before the grown-ups do. He rested one hand very lightly against her back and did not move. 20 minutes later, Dr. Bianchi returned. He stood in the doorway. He waited until Alessandro's eyes met his. Then he spoke only 3 quiet words. "There is something." Alessandro rose carefully, easing Emma into the chair still warm from him. He stepped into the hallway. "Traces," Bianchi murmured. "Foreign compound. Not enough to kill. Enough to weaken. To burn her out slowly. Someone wanted her tired, sir. Not dead." Alessandro looked past him, out through the small window at the end of the corridor, at the darkening Chicago sky. The old cold thing inside him, the thing he had spent years trying to lay down, lifted its head and opened its eyes. "Say nothing," he told Bianchi quietly. "To anyone. Not even Marco." Morning came slowly over the estate. Alessandro sat behind the wide oak desk in his study, a cup of black coffee cooling untouched beside his hand. He had not slept. He had spent the night in the chair by Sophia's window, watching the small rise and fall of her breathing, listening to the tiny sound Emma made when she shifted in her sleep. By dawn, he had returned to this room, changed into a fresh, dark suit, and become again the man the household expected to see. At precisely 9 o'clock, the door opened without a knock. Marco Bellini walked in the way he had walked into this room for more than 10 years, without ceremony, without hesitation, with the easy posture of a man who had earned the right to enter unannounced. He was 42, broad through the shoulders, dark-haired at the temples now, with a quiet, steady face that most men underestimated exactly once. He had been Alessandro's consigliere for over a decade. 3 winters ago, in Milano, he had stepped between Alessandro and a bullet meant for the head of the family. The scar of it still sat under his collarbone. To the outside world, and to almost everyone inside it, they were brothers. Marco laid a slim folder on the desk. "The Adriatic shipment cleared customs last night. No trouble. Good. The Ferraro problem is settled. Quietly. Good. We have 2 new men from Cicero. I want to try them on the East Gate before we place them anywhere else." Alessandro nodded slowly. He signed one page, then another. His hand did not tremble. His face did not change. Marco waited a beat too long before speaking again. "Sophia," he said, in the same easy tone. "I heard she has been unwell. Is she better?" Alessandro did not look up from the paper. "Only the flu," he said. "She will be fine in a few days." There it was, a silence, a very small one. The width of a breath. Any other man would have missed it. Any other morning, Alessandro himself might have missed it. But he had spent a lifetime listening to the shape of pauses in the mouths of dangerous men. He knew the sound of a question asked for the answer, and the sound of a question asked to test what the answer would be. Marco smiled. "Good. Please give her my regards. When she is up, I will." The 2 men held one another's eyes for a moment that neither of them acknowledged. Then Marco gathered the folder, gave a small nod, and left. Alessandro listened to the sound of his footsteps in the corridor. He waited until they faded completely. Then he picked up a second phone from a drawer he rarely opened. Not the household line, not the number Marco knew. He dialed 2 men, whose loyalty predated Marco's arrival in the family, men Marco had never hired, never questioned, never had reason to notice. His instruction was brief. Marco Bellini, every hour, every meeting, every phone, nothing on paper. Report only to me. He set the phone down. 3 days passed. Sophia's fever broke on the 2nd evening. By the 3rd afternoon, she was strong enough to sit up in bed and eat a little of the broth Dr. Bianchi had ordered for her. She was not yet strong enough to walk the halls. She was not yet strong enough to keep her 3-year-old still. And Emma, freed from a mother's watchful eye for the first time in her small life, began to wander. She wandered barefoot through corridors she had never been permitted to enter. She trailed her small fingers along the cool marble of the walls, peered into rooms full of dark furniture and heavy curtains, stopped to touch the tassels on rugs older than her mother. The men who guarded the estate did not know what to do with her. They stiffened as she passed. They watched her the way they might watch a small, unfamiliar animal that had wandered in from a garden. None of them dared to send her back. She found her way, that afternoon, to the tall carved door at the end of the east corridor. She did not know it was the door of a Mafia boss. The two men posted there exchanged a glance. One of them opened his mouth. He closed it again. He shifted his weight and looked at his colleague, who looked at the ceiling, then at his own boots. Neither of them had ever needed a plan for a child. Inside the room, Alessandro heard the small, hesitant sound of her voice. He rose from his desk and opened the door himself. Emma stood between the two large men with her hands clasped tightly around a folded sheet of paper. She looked up at him. She did not seem afraid this time, only serious, in the way small children are serious about the things that matter to them. "Come in," Alessandro said quietly. The guards did not meet his eyes. Emma padded past them into the study. She held the paper out to him with both hands, the way a courier delivers something important. Alessandro took it and unfolded it carefully. It was a drawing. A man in a black suit filled most of the page. His head was a large round circle. His arms hung down past his knees, 2 dots for eyes, a small, uncertain line for a mouth. Beside him, in tiny letters copied unevenly from somewhere, she had written a single word, "Ale." "I draw you," Emma said solemnly. Alessandro looked at the picture for a long time. In this room he had received signed contracts, sealed envelopes, coded ledgers, threats folded into elegant handwriting. No one, in all his years behind this desk, had ever handed him anything made simply because they had thought of him. "Thank you," he said. His voice came out lower than he had meant it to. He set the drawing on his desk, propped it carefully against a heavy silver pen holder so that it would not fall. Emma climbed onto the long leather sofa across the room, curled her legs under her, and settled in to watch him work. She said nothing. She only watched. Later, in the middle of a long phone call about a shipment out of Naples, he glanced over and found that she had fallen asleep. One small hand tucked under her cheek. He rose without breaking his conversation. He slipped off his black suit jacket, and very gently, he laid it across her small sleeping shoulders. The next morning, Alessandro made changes no one had thought to notice. Before Emma could wander back to his study, he moved quietly through the room and put away every dangerous thing. The pistol he kept in the top drawer went into a locked cabinet. The heavy folding blade in his desk went with it. The letter opener with the sharpened edge disappeared into a shelf too high for a small hand to reach. A carved lion figurine with a jagged base, an old gift from an old ally, was quietly turned to face the wall. Then he pulled a small wooden chair from a storage room down the corridor. He set it beside his own leather chair, close enough to reach, low enough for a 3-year-old to climb into by herself. He looked at it for a long moment before he sat back down at his desk. He rang the kitchen once. "From today," he told the head cook, "prepare full portions for Miss Sophia and her daughter. Every meal. They eat with me in the main dining room." The cook was silent for so long that Alessandro almost had to ask if she was still on the line. "Yes, sir," she said finally. "Of course, sir." By evening, Sophia was strong enough to walk. She came into the dining room on cautious feet, one hand holding Emma's, wearing the plain gray dress she reserved for cleaning days because it was the only one she had that felt clean enough for a room like this. Alessandro was already seated at the head of the long table. He rose when she entered. Sophia did not know what to do with that. She sat down where he indicated, and folded her hands in her lap, and did not lift her eyes above the tablecloth. The first dinner was quiet, almost painfully so. Emma sat between them on a cushion, small and unusually still, sensing without understanding that something important was happening. The second dinner was different. Halfway through the soup, Emma reached for her water glass with too much confidence and knocked it clean across the table. Water spread in a bright, spreading map across the white linen. Sophia's face went pale. "Oh, I'm so sorry, sir." Alessandro raised one hand. He looked at Emma. Emma looked at him. Her lower lip trembled, waiting for the storm. "It happens," he said simply. And then, perhaps because Emma had been waiting so hard for him to be angry that when he was not, her small body did not know where to put the fear, she laughed. A bright, surprised, unstoppable laugh. The sound rang against the tall windows. It filled the great, silent dining room in a way nothing had filled it in years. Sophia looked up. She saw, then, what she had not been able to see before, not the boss of the Moretti family, but a man carefully cutting an apple into small, even slices for a child, arranging the pieces on her plate in a neat little circle so she could reach them. The line of his mouth had softened, his shoulders had lowered. Down the far corridor, the door of the dining room stood open by a narrow crack. Marco Bellini paused there. He watched, only for a moment, before he moved on. His face, when he turned away, had gone very still and very cold. A man without weakness cannot be broken. Marco Bellini did not go home the way most men do. He drove through the wet Chicago streets with the radio off and his knuckles white on the wheel. He did not speak to the doorman of his building. He did not glance at the young couple sharing a laugh in the elevator beside him. He unlocked the door of his private apartment on the 21st floor, stepped inside, closed it behind him, and only then did the face he had worn all day slide away. The mask fell. Underneath it was a colder man, a tired man, a man who had not smiled honestly in longer than he could remember. He walked to the low cabinet by the window and poured himself 2 fingers of whiskey. He did not bother with ice. He carried the glass to the tall window that looked out over the north side of the city and stood there in the dark, watching the traffic below thread its slow, patient patterns of light. 10 years. 10 years he had stood at Alessandro's shoulder. 10 years he had read every contract before Alessandro signed it. 10 years he had smiled at men whose names Alessandro would not remember by morning, and remembered them himself, and killed them himself when the time came for it. 3 times he had put his own body between his boss and the bullet meant for him. There was a scar under his collarbone. There was another along his ribs. There was one, thin and pale, at the base of his neck. None of them had ever made him more than a consigliere. He drank slowly. The whiskey burned in a way that was almost comforting. How many nights had he sat in rooms like this one, imagining the weight of the ring, the sound of his own name spoken with the deference Alessandro's name commanded. How many times had he thought quietly, only to himself, I could sit in that chair. I have earned that chair. Now, for the first time in 10 years, the chair could be his. A small girl had handed him the key without ever knowing it. He took his second phone from a drawer in the writing desk, a phone Alessandro did not know existed, that only 3 men in this world had the number for. He dialed. The line clicked open. The plan moves, Marco said quietly. He has a weakness now. The voice on the other end answered in one word. Marco ended the call. He set the phone down and returned to the window. He should have felt lighter. Instead, something small and cold was moving in his chest. He had noticed things today. There had been a dark sedan parked opposite the estate's south wall from morning until well past noon. The same car, the same tinted windows, a driver he did not recognize. And the new man at the east gate, the one who had bowed politely to him this morning, was not on any list Marco had signed off on. He had asked, casually, who had brought him in. No one had given him a straight answer. Marco's fingers tightened around the whiskey glass. He might have been Maid. He might already be walking through a house that was watching him. Then move faster, he told himself. Move now. By the end of the week, Sophia was on her feet again. The color had returned to her cheeks. She walked without holding the walls. She insisted on returning to work, and Alessandro, after one long look at her, had allowed it on the condition that she did not lift anything heavier than a folded linen and that she took an hour of rest in the afternoon. She had bowed her head. She had not argued. Work was the only ground she had ever felt safe standing on. That afternoon, a fresh stack of clean towels waited to be carried up to the 2nd floor. Sophia took them herself. She climbed the wide staircase slowly, one hand on the banister, humming very quietly the same small tune Emma had learned from her. The corridor above was long, lined with dark doors, silent in the way only very large houses are silent in the middle of the day. She was almost past the small sitting room next to Alessandro's study when she heard the voice. Marco. He was speaking on the phone. The door was closed, but not properly. A hand's width of it stood open, and the words drifted out into the corridor in fragments, low and careful, the way men speak when they do not want to be overheard. The schedule for Thursday. Sophia's feet slowed without her telling them to. The ambush point. Yes, we need this ended sooner. The stack of towels grew suddenly heavy in her arms. The girl. Yes, the girl is what does it. Her blood turned to cold water inside her. She had grown up on the edges of neighborhoods where certain stories were told in whispers. Stories about women who cleaned in the wrong houses. Women who had seen the wrong faces on the wrong nights. Women who had grown mysteriously ill and quietly died before anyone thought to ask why. She had heard those stories all her life. She had never, until now, understood that she had been living inside one. She turned before the door could open. She walked back down the corridor as quietly as she had come. That evening, after Emma was asleep, Sofia stood outside the door of Alessandro's study for a very long time, before she found the courage to knock. She told him everything, every fragment, every word, the half-open door, the name of the day, the mention of the girl. Her voice trembled, but she did not stop until she had given him all of it. Alessandro sat very still behind his desk. His face did not change. He did not interrupt. He listened the way he listened to men he already knew he was going to have to answer. Only his right hand moved. It had closed around a heavy black pen, and it closed tighter as she spoke, and tighter still, until the knuckles above his ring had gone bone white. When she finished, there was a long silence. Then, quietly, "In my world, feelings cannot stand above evidence." Sofia was trembling now. "You will kill him, won't you?" Alessandro looked at her. His eyes were very dark. "Not yet," he said. "I need to know who he is working with. All of them." He set the pen down at last. Morning arrived, and Alessandro Moretti did the hardest thing he had done in years. He smiled at Marco. He smiled the same smile he had worn for a decade, in the same doorway, over the same desk. He asked about Marco's night. He listened, nodding, as Marco walked him through the week's operations. He signed the papers Marco placed before him. He clapped his consigliere lightly on the shoulder on the way to the dining room, and shared coffee with him at the small side table by the tall window, the way they had shared coffee every morning for 10 years. At noon, they ate together. Marco told a story about a young enforcer from Cicero who had confused two similar street names and delivered a message to the wrong door. Alessandro laughed. He laughed with his eyes as well as his mouth, and only he himself knew what it cost him. Two masters of concealment sat across from one another at that table. Neither blinked. Below the surface of the estate, a second house was quietly built. Small microphones went into the trims of certain doors. A pair of new cameras appeared in the shape of ordinary smoke detectors. Two of Alessandro's oldest men who had answered to his father before him, were moved to positions that let them watch every corridor Marco favored. Every phone Marco touched inside the house was mirrored to a device only Alessandro could open. Nothing was written down. Nothing was spoken aloud outside the study. The trap was being laid in silence, one silk thread at a time, around a man who had been trained to feel every silk thread. And yet, in the same house, another thing was happening. The dinners with Sofia and Emma became something Alessandro had no other word for except sacred. One evening, Emma taught him how to draw a sun. She held his large hand around a yellow crayon and dragged it across a piece of paper in an uneven circle, then added 5 wobbly rays like small fingers reaching outward. Alessandro tried it on his own on a second sheet. His sun came out lopsided, more like an egg than a star. Sofia laughed a real, startled laugh she seemed almost embarrassed by and pressed her hand to her mouth. Alessandro looked up at her. He did not laugh back. He only watched her, the way a man watches the first true light in a room he had forgotten had a window. Later that night, he stood on the stone balcony of the second floor with a glass of wine in his hand, looking down at the dim shapes of the garden. Sofia came out with a folded blanket and paused when she saw him. He turned. He did not send her away. They stood there together in a long, quiet piece of silence. "For years," he said finally, without looking at her, "I thought a house full of men was the same thing as not being alone." Sofia did not answer at once. She only stepped a little closer to the railing. "It isn't," she said softly. "No," said Alessandro. "It isn't. Somewhere out beyond the wall, a dark car sat too long in the same place under the same streetlight. Marco, at his window on the 21st floor, saw it. He did not sleep that night. That same night, Marco Bellini decided he would not wait for morning. He had spent the small hours at his window turning the pieces in his mind. The unfamiliar car, the unfamiliar face at the east gate, the way one of the older men had glanced away from him a beat too quickly at dinner. He no longer needed to be certain. Certainty, in his world, arrived only after it was too late. He needed to move while he still could. At 9:30 the next evening, one of Marco's men made a phone call from a public line, 6 blocks from the estate. The voice on the other end reported an intruder inside the western storage compound, men on the fence, the sound of glass breaking, someone with a weapon moving between the crates. Alessandro received the report in his study. He did what any careful man would have done. He dispatched a team. He included, without hesitation, 2 of his key personal guards, because a false alarm was still an alarm, and a real threat had to be met with real weight. The house did not empty, but for 11 quiet minutes. The shell of it grew thinner in exactly the way Marco had needed it to. In those 11 minutes, Marco walked calmly through corridors he had walked for 10 years. He did not hurry. Hurrying is the way strangers move. He nodded to the housekeeper, turning down beds at the far end of the second floor. He passed the small chair that had been placed beside Alessandro's desk without looking at it. He entered the playroom. Emma sat on the rug in her small pajamas, alone, carefully building a tower of pale wooden blocks. She had already stacked 7 of them. She looked up when the door opened, and her whole face lit with the easy, uncomplicated joy of a child who had never once been given a reason to be afraid of the man in front of her. "Uncle Marco." He crouched. He held one finger to his lips. The scene did not go beyond that. Only the soft sound of a small child's laughter being gently hushed. Only a large hand closing carefully around a smaller one. Only the quiet click of a door pulled shut from the outside. The blocks, half stacked, stayed on the rug. 15 minutes later, Sophia passed the playroom on her way to fetch a fresh blanket from the linen closet. She glanced in through the open doorway out of habit and saw the tower of blocks standing alone on the rug in the empty room. No small feet, no small breath, no small voice. The sound she made was not quite a word. It rose through the great house like a wound tearing open. It brought servants running from the kitchens. It brought guards up the stairs 3 at a time. It reached Alessandro on the drive as his car turned back through the gate, and he was out of the vehicle before it had fully stopped. He came through the front door at a run. Chaos. Shouting. Doors flung open. Sophia collapsed on the corridor floor outside the playroom, both hands over her mouth, her whole body shaking. Alessandro stepped into the room. The tower of blocks, the empty rug, and there, near the leg of the small chair, a folded sheet of paper that had slipped out of a tiny hand as it was lifted from the floor. He picked it up. He unfolded it. 3 figures, drawn in crayon. Sophia, Emma, a tall man in a black suit. He folded the drawing again, carefully, and slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket, over his heart. The phone in Alessandro's inside pocket vibrated against his chest. He drew it out slowly. The number on the screen belonged to no contact in the world. Around him, the house was still in the ugly hush that follows a scream. Servants frozen in doorways, guards standing at attention with their faces pale. Sophia curled on the corridor floor with both arms wrapped around her ribs. Alessandro lifted the phone to his ear. "Speak." A pause. Then a voice he had known for a decade, but not this voice. The warmth was gone. The easy humor was gone. What was left was quiet, cold, and terribly familiar in the way certain kinds of hatred always are when they finally take their mask off. "You never really saw me, did you, Alessandro?" Alessandro said nothing. 10 years, Marco went on. 10 years I stood behind you. 10 years I killed for you. I bled for you in Milano, and you handed me a folder the next morning like nothing had happened. You never once thought that the man at your shoulder might want the chair. And now, because of a child, you finally look up. He paused, and when he continued, his voice was almost businesslike. I have made arrangements. There is a family that wants what you have. I have promised them the roots, the docks, the men, and you are going to help me give it to them. Where? Alessandro said. The abandoned freight warehouse at the edge of Little Ravenswood. The old Baroni lot. You know it. I know it. You come alone. No cars behind you. No men on foot. No one in the buildings across the street. If I see a shadow that does not belong to you, the girl does not come home. When you arrive, you will sign every route over to me, every contract, every account. Then you will speak, on camera, and you will resign as head of the Moretti family. After that, we will discuss what happens to the child. Alessandro's grip on the phone was perfectly steady. I need to hear her, he said. Alive. There was a small sound, a hand adjusting the phone. Then a voice so small it barely reached him. Uncle Ale. His eyes closed. I want to go home. Something inside him bent under a weight he had not known a man could carry. I'm coming, sweetheart, he said, and his voice was quiet enough that only she would hear the way it shook. Uncle is coming. The line went dead. Alessandro lowered the phone. He turned. Sophia was pushing herself up from the floor, half crawling toward him, her face swollen and shining with tears. She reached him and grabbed the front of his jacket in both hands the way a drowning person grabs a rope. Please, please, bring her back, please. He did not pull her hands away. He set the phone on the small table beside them, took her trembling wrists in his, and folded them gently against his own chest, over the folded drawing pressed there in the inside pocket. Listen to me, Sophia. She lifted her eyes to his. I promise you. His voice was low and absolutely certain. I will bring Emma home. Alessandro moved with the quiet speed of a man who no longer had time to be gentle with himself. He walked Sophia back into the drawing room, sat her down on the low couch, and told the head housekeeper to stay with her and not to leave her side for any reason. Then he went to his study, closed the door behind him, and locked it. He did not use the main house line. He did not use the phone, Marco knew. From the same drawer he had opened once before, he took a small black handset that had no number and made no records. He dialed 3 men whose loyalty was older than Marco's presence in this family, men who had served Alessandro's father before him, whose faces Marco had glanced past for years without ever bothering to remember. In 3 short calls he gave 3 sets of instructions: rooftops, the old Baroni freight lot, 3 angles of approach, north, west, and the low warehouse across the alley to the south. No radios inside the strike zone. No cars closer than 4 blocks. No movement, no matter what they saw or heard, until he gave the signal. The signal was simple. He would raise his left hand to adjust his wristwatch. That was all. He set the phone down. For one moment, he pressed both palms flat against the wood of his desk and closed his eyes. When he opened them again, the man behind the desk was not entirely the same man who had cut apples into small, even slices in the dining room a few nights before. The old boss had come back into the room, the one who thought in maps and doorways, in angles and lines of sight, in whose men were on which corner at what time, the one who did not miss anything. But the old boss had come back for a reason no old boss of the Moretti family had ever come back for. Not an empire, not a name, not a shipment or a border or a bloodline, a 3-year-old with crayon on her fingers. He crossed to the far side of the desk. He lifted the small silver pen holder. The drawing was still there where he had left it that morning, the round-headed man in the black suit, and beside him now the newer picture, the one that had slipped from Emma's hand on the playroom floor. Sophia, Emma, a tall man in a black suit. He folded that second drawing along the crease she had already given it, then folded it once again, smaller, tighter, until it fit into the inside pocket of his vest, close against his chest, close against the heart of a man who had spent many years pretending he no longer had one. When he turned to leave, Sophia was standing in the doorway of the study. She had come without a sound. In her open palm lay a small hair clip, pink, plastic, in the shape of a flower, one of Emma's. She could not speak. She only held it out to him. He took it carefully. He folded her fingers back over her own hand and closed his around them for one long moment. "Give it back to her," she whispered. "Please, give it back to her yourself." Alessandro looked into her eyes. "Wait for me." He walked out into the courtyard alone. He got into the black car alone. He drove into the night alone. The Barone freight lot smelled of rust and old rain. The tall metal doors had been dragged half open, and yellow light spilled out onto the cracked concrete in a narrow, sickly stripe. Somewhere inside, an old fluorescent tube buzzed on and off, painting the walls in slow, uneven flashes. Alessandro parked the black car at the edge of the lot and walked the last 30 meters alone. He did not hurry. He did not slow. He stepped through the half-open door and into the warehouse. The space was vast and empty. Water stains ran down the corrugated walls. Old shipping crates were stacked in crooked columns along one side, half-rotten, tagged with faded lettering no one had bothered to read in years. Along the far wall, 8 men stood in a careful line. They were not Marco's men. They wore the coats of another family. One Alessandro had recognized before he had finished reading the plates on the black van outside. Weapons rested easily in their hands. None of them spoke. In the center of the floor stood Marco. And a few meters from him, tied to a low wooden chair, sat Emma. Her small feet did not reach the ground. Her hair had come loose from its braid. Her cheeks were shining with tears that had not stopped for a long time. A rope had been passed around her tiny waist and knotted behind the chair back, and her hands were folded in her lap because they had put them there. When she saw him, she opened her mouth and cried harder, the raw, exhausted crying of a child who has been holding herself together too long. "Uncle Ale." Alessandro's face did not change. He stopped in the middle of the concrete floor. Marco spread his arms in an almost theatrical welcome. "There he is," he said softly. "The boss without a weakness. The great Alessandro Moretti, walking into my trap on his own 2 feet for a 3-year-old whose mother scrubs your floors." Alessandro let his eyes rest on Marco for one long, unhurried second. Then he turned his head, deliberately, and looked at Emma. He held her small red gaze across the concrete. He let her see that he had come. He let her see that he was not afraid. Then he looked back at the man he had trusted for 10 years. "She did not make me weak, Marco." His voice was quiet. It carried without effort in the empty space. "She gave me a reason to come home." Something moved, very briefly, behind Marco's eyes. Then he smiled, and it was a small, ugly smile, and he snapped his fingers. One of the men from the wall stepped forward and placed a thin stack of documents on top of a crate at Alessandro's elbow. A silver pen was laid across the top page. Alessandro picked up the pen. He signed the first page slowly. Every route, the docks, the northern warehouses. He signed the second page, the southern accounts. He signed the third, the fourth. He did not read them. He did not need to. He signed with the calm hand of a man who had already made his peace with every line his signature crossed. He set the pen down. "Now," he said, lifting his eyes to Marco. "Release the girl." Marco laughed. He did not move. Marco's laugh trailed off into something colder. "Do you really think," he said, "that I am going to let either of you walk out of here alive?" The words landed in the empty warehouse the way a stone lands in still water. Along the far wall, the 8 men shifted almost imperceptibly. Weapons that had been resting rose to a position that was no longer resting. The dull metal caught the yellow light and threw it back in short, ugly gleams. Emma cried out from her chair, "Uncle Ale!" Alessandro did not turn his head. He kept his eyes on Marco, and he kept them completely still. His hands stayed where they were, one at his side, one resting lightly on the edge of the crate that held the signed papers. His breathing did not change. His face did not change. He looked at the man who had once stepped in front of a bullet for him, and he waited. Marco began, then, to talk. He talked the way a man talks when a wound has finally been given permission to bleed. "Do you remember Milano?" he said. "You flew out that same night. You did not wait for me to come out of surgery. There was a shipment. There was always a shipment. I woke up alone in a room in a hospital where nobody spoke my language, and you had already been in the air for 4 hours." Alessandro did not answer. "Do you remember the council meeting after the Cicero business? When old Ricci laughed at me across the table? When he said I gave good advice for a boy from the wrong neighborhood? You sat there. You did not correct him. You let the room laugh with him. And afterward you said to me, in the car, 'Do not take everything so seriously, Marco.'" His voice roughened, but he did not raise it. "Do you remember what I brought home to my wife every night for 10 years? A ring that was never mine. A house paid for by your name. And do you know what she said to me the last time I lay next to her? She said, 'Why are you still just a consigliere, Marco?' She said it, and she rolled away, and she went to sleep. And I stared at the ceiling until the sun came up." He took one slow step forward. "You never once looked at me and saw a man, Alessandro. You saw a hand, a useful hand, and you never asked what the hand wanted." Alessandro listened. He listened as if he were memorizing every word, and perhaps he was. Then, very quietly, without ever breaking Marco's eyes, he lifted his left hand. He turned his wrist. He touched 2 fingers to the face of his watch, as if adjusting the time, and let the hand fall again. That was all. Out in the darkness, on the low roof of the warehouse across the alley, a man lying flat against cold tin lowered his eye to the scope and steadied his breath. On the roof to the north, another man did the same. To the west, a third. Marco was still talking. "You do not even understand what you are losing tonight. You never will. Men like you never do." He did not know that he had already run out of time. From the yard behind the warehouse came a single sharp crack, a shot, precise, muted by distance. The outer floodlights on the east side of the lot went black in one clean sweep. There are silences in a man's life that mean the world is about to end. There are silences that mean it is about to begin again. Everything happened at once. The high windows along the eastern wall shattered inward in 3 quick bursts of sound and glass. Somewhere above, boots landed hard on the corrugated roof. The tall metal doors behind Marco's men swung open from the outside, and figures moved through them in the low, silent way of men who had done this before. A shout went up from the far corner of the warehouse. Another cracked back to answer it. The buzzing fluorescent tube overhead flickered wildly under the vibration, then died, and the yellow light gave way to sudden darkness broken only by bright, brief flashes. Emma screamed. Marco spun toward the sound of the shattered windows. His hand went to his belt. Alessandro did not move toward Marco. In the single heartbeat when everyone else in that warehouse turned outward, toward the noise and the flashes and the men pouring in through the doors, Alessandro Moretti turned inward and ran. 3 long strides carried him across the concrete to the small wooden chair. He did not stop to untie the rope. He did not have time. He lifted the chair, Emma and all, and pulled her against his chest, and pressed his own body between hers and the room. Something tore across the top of his right shoulder. He felt the heat of it before he felt the pain. He heard the small, dull sound of fabric giving way. He did not cry out. He did not stagger. He did not stop. He turned his back into the fighting and ran toward the doors he had come in through. Emma held tight against him, one large hand cradling the back of her small head so she could not see what was happening around them. At the doorway, one of his oldest men, the man who had answered to Alessandro's father, was already moving to meet him. His face was set. His eyes were clear. Alessandro slid the small chair down between them and pried the rope from around her waist with 2 sharp motions of his fingers. Emma flew into his arms the moment she was free, both small hands fisted in the front of his jacket, sobbing into his neck. He passed her, very carefully, into the older man's arms. "Take her out," he said quietly. "The car, the far side of the lot. Do not put her down. Do not take your eyes off her. Not for 1 second. Not for anything. Do you understand me?" "Yes, sir." "Uncle Ale." Emma reached for him over the older man's shoulder, both small arms stretched wide, her face crumpling all over again. Alessandro leaned in. He pressed his forehead very gently against her small forehead. "Uncle is coming back," he whispered. "I promise." Then he turned. The front of his own white dress shirt, the same kind of shirt that a pair of small red hands had once tried so bravely to iron on a plastic chair in a quiet room, was no longer white. A dark, spreading stain had opened at the top of his right shoulder and was creeping down toward the collar. He did not look at it. He walked back into the warehouse. Marco was still there, in the middle of the concrete floor, in the flashes of muzzle light and the falling glass, alone now, his gun raised, his eyes wide with the particular fear of a man who has finally understood that the trap was never his. The last of the outside men were already down or already gone. Alessandro's people moved through the warehouse the way winter moves through an open door, steady, cold, everywhere at once. A few of Marco's rented gunmen had thrown down their weapons the moment they understood the count. Others had tried the back doors and found other men already waiting there. The rest were on the concrete, cuffed at the wrist, no longer part of what was about to happen next. The wide floor emptied around the 2 of them. Marco stood alone in the middle of it, his pistol raised in a hand that was, for the first time in 10 years, not entirely steady. Alessandro walked toward him. He did not run. He did not shout. He drew from the inside of his jacket, quietly, a slim folding blade, the same one he had carried since he was young, the one his father had given him, and let it open in his hand. "Stop where you are," Marco said. Alessandro did not stop. There is a distance at which a gun becomes a very different thing to a man who has decided not to be afraid of it. Alessandro closed that distance. Marco fired once. The sound cracked huge in the empty space. The shot went wide. Then Alessandro was inside his arm. There was no clean description of what happened in those few seconds, only the sound of breath and cloth and metal. The dull sound of a wrist being turned the wrong way, the sharp scrape of the pistol skittering across concrete, a low grunt from one of them, the heavy sound of a knee striking the floor. When it was over, Marco was on his back. Alessandro was above him. The blade in his hand rested lightly against the side of Marco's throat, close enough that Marco did not dare to swallow. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Marco's chest rose and fell in short, ragged jerks. His eyes were bright and wet. Alessandro's voice, when it finally came, was almost gentle. "Do you know what hurts the most, Marco?" Marco did not answer. "It is not the bullet." Alessandro let his gaze move, once, over the man beneath him, the scar under the collarbone, the graying temples, the face he had trusted at his own table for a decade. "It is the 10 years I believed you." Marco's mouth opened. His voice came out cracked and hoarse. "You never understood," he whispered. "You never understood how many years I had to stand behind you. How many years I smiled while I know." Alessandro said quietly. "I know now." He held the blade there for one more heartbeat. Then, very slowly, he lifted it. He rose to his feet. He turned to the 2 men who had come up behind him at some point without his noticing, breathing hard, ready. "Keep him alive," Alessandro said. "I need every name in that other family. Every man, every account, every doc, all of it." They moved in. Alessandro folded the blade and slipped it back into his jacket. He walked out of the warehouse alone. The night air outside was cold and wet, and smelled of old rain on concrete. His white shirt was heavy with a slow, dark spreading. He barely felt it. Across the lot, at the far edge of the yellow streetlight, the older man was lifting a small figure carefully into the back of a waiting car. Emma looked up. She saw him. She reached out one tiny hand. The gate of the estate opened before the car had fully slowed. Alessandro stepped out onto the drive with his right sleeve heavy and dark, one hand pressed loosely against the top of his shoulder. Dr. Bianchi was already there, his case open on a table just inside the front door, his sleeves rolled to the elbow. The house was awake in every window. Every servant had come up out of the lower floors. Every guard stood at attention along the wide hall. Sophia was in the front room. She held Emma against her chest so tightly that when the little girl saw Alessandro come through the doorway, Sophia felt her own arms open before her mind had finished making the decision. Emma ran. She ran the way small children run off balance. Uneven, both arms flung wide, a small sob already breaking out of her before she had crossed half the distance. Alessandro dropped to one knee to meet her. The movement pulled at the wound in his shoulder in a way that made his jaw lock, but his face did not show it. She struck him with all the weight her tiny body could manage, and her small arms went around his neck and stayed there. He closed his eyes. For a moment, he was not a boss. He was not a man in a torn white shirt. He was only somebody's Uncle Ale, holding a child who had come home. When she finally lifted her head, her small hand touched, very gently, the darkened edge of his sleeve. Uncle Ale. Her voice was so small. Are you hurt because of me? Alessandro could not speak for a long second. The question stood between them in the still air of the great hall, and it went into him deeper than the wound had, because it was a question only a child in his position was innocent enough and unguarded enough to ask. He drew back just far enough to look into her face. No, little one, he whispered. Not because of you. He touched his forehead to hers. Because I did not want to lose you. Behind him, in the doorway, Sophia was crying silently with one hand pressed against her mouth. 2 days passed. Then 3. Emma slept through most of them, small hand curled into her mother's shirt. Dr. Bianchi came and went. The stitches in Alessandro's shoulder pulled tight when he moved, but he moved anyway. On the 4th evening, Sophia came to his study. She sat down across from him. Her hands lay folded in her lap. She did not lift her eyes to his at first. Mr. Moretti, she said quietly, I have to take her away. He did not interrupt. Your world, she said. It is not a place for her. I keep seeing that rope, that chair. I keep seeing her small hand reaching over a stranger's shoulder. If we stay one day, something like this happens again. And next time it does not end this way. She lifted her eyes at last. Alessandro did not argue. He let her words settle in the room. Then, very slowly, he spoke. This house, he said, has never been a home. Only a fortress. Something men come back to between wars. He looked past her, to the small chair that still sat beside his desk. The evening I first found her on that little chair, trying to do a grown woman's work, that was the first time in many years I saw something in this house that was actually alive. Sophia said nothing. Sophia stayed. She did not announce her decision. She simply did not leave. In the morning, she came back to work with a small basket of clean linens over one arm, and Emma trotted at her side with a fresh crayon drawing already in her hand, and Alessandro understood, without a word being spoken, that the long silence had answered itself. In the weeks that followed, the Moretti family changed in ways old men in old rooms would spend years trying to make sense of. Alessandro sat down with the eldest members of the council and laid down a new rule that had never before been spoken inside a family like theirs. From this day forward, no wife, no mother, no child of anyone under this name would ever be drawn into the quarrels of the men. Anyone who broke that rule would answer to him personally. There was some grumbling. There was less than he had expected. Old men, it turned out, had sometimes been waiting their whole lives to hear a boss say such a thing out loud. He opened a private fund in the name of his father. Every family that worked in the estate, every driver, every cook, every gardener, every housekeeper would have their children's schooling covered. Doctors, medicines, winter coats. A quiet number, taken care of quietly. Sophia was the first to hear about it. She cried for a long time, and then she thanked him, and then she went back to folding the linens. She was no longer the housekeeper. She became the woman who ran the estate. Every day the household turned around her calm, careful hands. And Emma, 3 years old and utterly unafraid, became the only person alive who could push open the door of the boss's study without knocking. The guards learned to step aside for her the way they stepped aside for no one else in Chicago. Between Alessandro and Sophia, something quiet grew. Neither of them rushed it. Neither of them needed to. 3 months later, on a bright winter morning, Alessandro rose to prepare for an important meeting. He walked into the dressing room, adjusting the cuff of one sleeve, and stopped. Emma was there. She stood beside the pressing board on her own 2 small feet, no chair in sight. On the board, neatly folded, sat a crisp white dress shirt that had already been pressed by her mother's steady hands. The iron sat unplugged and safely off to one side. Alessandro looked at the iron. He looked at Emma. Emma shook her head, grinning like a small, pleased conspirator. "No," she said. "I not iron today." Instead, she lifted, in both hands, a small yellow silk necktie printed with cheerful cartoon ducks. "Uncle, wear this one?" Alessandro took the tie from her. He looked at it for exactly 1 second. Then he put it on with his black suit. He walked downstairs. Sophia was at the foot of the staircase, a coffee cup halfway to her mouth. She looked up, saw the ducks, and burst out laughing, a real, warm, uncomplicated laugh that filled the great hall the way a hearth fills a cold room. "Ale," she said, wiping her eyes. "Please tell me you are not serious." Alessandro adjusted the small yellow tie with 2 careful fingers and shrugged. Emma chose. At the top of the stairs, a small girl beamed down at both of them, and in that moment, Alessandro Moretti, the man Chicago had feared, the boss of an empire built from silence and steel, finally understood that he had gained the one thing, money and power, and the whole Moretti name had never once been able to give him: a family, and a home worth coming back to. Dear friends, thank you for staying with us until the very end of this story. Alessandro's life carries within it a truth worth taking with us today. For many years, he believed that true strength meant having nothing to lose, no soft places, no open doors, no small hands that could pull his heart wherever they wished. And yet, in the end, it was not the absence of weakness that made him strong. It was the courage to love again, even knowing that love always carries the possibility of pain. Real strength is not a fortress with no windows. It is a man who dares to open the door and let someone walk in. Now we would love to hear from you. Has there ever been a moment in your own life when someone small, someone unexpected, quietly opened a door in your heart you thought had been closed for good? A child, a stranger, a kindness that came at exactly the right time? Please share your feelings with us in the comments below. We read every single one, and every story matters to us. If this story touched something inside you, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone you love, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss a new story. Your support means everything, and it helps us bring more heartfelt, meaningful videos to you every single day. From all of us on this channel, we wish you good health, a peaceful heart, and quiet joy in the days ahead. May your home be warm. May your loved ones stay close. And may you always find one small hand somewhere in your life that reminds you what really matters. Goodbye for now, dear friends, and we will see you again very soon in the next video.